At 3:30 in the morning on Monday, April 20th, 2026, the residents of Wellington, New Zealand's capital city, were asleep. Outside, it was raining. It is often raining in Wellington, which sits at the southern tip of the North Island in one of the windiest and wettest corridors in the southern hemisphere. People who live in Wellington are used to rain. They are used to wind. They are used to weather that other parts of New Zealand describe as extreme and that Wellingtonians describe as Tuesday. So when the rain began in the early hours of Monday morning, most people slept through it. And then the streams came through their front doors. A woman named Mick Breitenbach woke at around 4 a.m. to a sound she could not immediately identify. Gurgling, coming from somewhere inside her bedroom. She sat up. She put her feet on the floor. She stepped into 10 centimeters of standing water. She told Radio New Zealand's midday report, "As soon as I put my feet down, I stepped into about maybe 10 centimeters of water." The gurgling sound was water seeping up through the floorboards. It was nonstop. She and her 3 flatmates realized simultaneously what was happening. They also realized that the ground floor exit of their home, the front door, now had a meter of water outside it, moving. They went out through the back instead, arms interlocked, water surging past them. They had prepared a go bag for Cyclone Vaianu, which had swept through the North Island the week before. That bag saved time they did not have. In the suburb of Mount Cook, a woman named Jane Loughnan woke up at around 4:30 a.m., looked outside her window on Wright Street, and saw cars floating. Not one car, half a dozen cars, lifted by floodwater and drifting. She told RNZ, "There was water down the bottom of my path, which has never happened before." Debris had come down through the Papawai stream and flooded the lower end of the street. Mud was everywhere. Tow trucks were arriving, trying to work out how they were going to tow cars that were still partially submerged. In Ōwhiro Bay on Wellington's south coast, at least one vehicle was swept roughly 150 meters along Happy Valley Road by the floodwaters and into the sea. A resident there spotted a fridge floating in the water. 3 more cars in the bay were simply missing. A resident named Jess Allen told RNZ that the Ōwhiro stream had raged overnight, that families had been forced to evacuate in the darkness, that someone had climbed out of their window to reach a neighbor's house. She said there were cars on the beach that had been washed out of the streets. In the suburb of Karori, on South Karori Road, a different story was unfolding. The one that would become the heart of this disaster. The one that would occupy search teams for 2 days. The one that would end on Wednesday afternoon, April 22nd, with a community in grief. A man named Philip Sutton, in his 60s, lived alone at a property on Karori South Road. He was a postman, a delivery agent for NZ Post, a man who had worked for that organization for more than 20 years, walking the streets of Karori in all weathers, known by his colleagues and by the community he served. He was the kind of person that postmen are when they are good at their job, familiar, reliable, part of the texture of a neighborhood. At some point in the early hours of Monday morning, the Karori stream, which runs through that area on its way to the sea, stopped being a stream and became something else entirely. A family member called emergency services at approximately 7 a.m., unable to make contact with Philip. When police and search and rescue teams arrived at the South Karori Road property, they found a house hit by floodwaters and debris. Philip Sutton was not inside. The property was searched. The surrounding area was searched. Police vans moved through the neighborhood. Search and rescue teams spent hours clearing the property and the road. The weather was abysmal. Met Service had upgraded the rain warning for Wellington and Wairarapa to red, the highest possible level, meaning a threat to life from dangerous river conditions. The search was called off Monday night. It could not safely resume until Wednesday. Tuesday was spent planning, assessing, identifying areas of interest, the stream, its tributaries, the route from Karori south to the coast. Wednesday morning, the search got underway again at 8 a.m. The team included canyon search and rescue specialists, a dive squad, search dogs, and drones. At just before 11 a.m. on Wednesday, a search team found Philip Sutton's silver Suzuki Swift in Karori Stream, about 1 kilometer from where it had been parked before the flooding began. The car had sustained what police described as moderate damage, considering what it must have gone through. Constable Steve Ewart told reporters that by the time the water had receded enough to search on Wednesday, the flow rate of the Karori stream was 4 cubic meters per second. That is still a fast, powerful stream. At the peak of Monday morning's rainfall, the flow rate of the Karori stream had been measured at 100 cubic meters per second. That is not a creek. That is a force that moves cars. That is a force that, if you're standing in the wrong place when it arrives, gives you no choices. At just before noon on Wednesday, a body was found approximately 7 kilometers from Karori South Road, near the mouth of the stream at the south coast. Inspector Fleur de Bez addressed the media. She said, "Unfortunately, we found him deceased, but we can bring him back for his family, which is really important." She said, "This is not the outcome any of us were hoping for, and our thoughts are with his family and friends at this awful time." NZ Post CEO David Walsh said his organization was profoundly saddened. He said Philip Sutton had been a valued member of the NZ Post team, working as a delivery agent in Wellington for more than 20 years. He was well known and liked by both his colleagues and the community he served. Philip's family, through police, asked for their privacy to be respected. They also expressed thanks for the public's concern and support during the search. A dead cow had washed up on Island Bay Beach after the storm. Philip Sutton's car had ended up in Karori Stream, a kilometer from where he parked it. The Ōwhiro Stream had broken bridges. A house in Vogeltown had partially collapsed after a hillside slip undercut its foundations, leaving the structure hanging at the edge of an unstable slope. Wellington's capital city, one of the most beautiful and livable places in the southern hemisphere, had been taken apart by water in a single night. To understand how this happened, how a city with warning systems and civil defense infrastructure and weather forecasting technology experienced a disaster of this magnitude, you need to understand three things: what kind of water event this was, what made Wellington specifically so vulnerable, and what was happening to the ground across the North Island before a single drop of Monday morning's rain had fallen. Start with the rain itself. Wellington's mayor Andrew Little announced on Monday that 77 millimeters of rain had fallen in a single hour at one location in the city. Victoria University climate change professor James Renwick was asked about that figure and said simply that it would be extreme even in the tropics. To give you a sense of what that number means in Wellington's context, the city's botanical gardens typically receives around 130 millimeters of rain across the entire month of April. In 1 hour on Monday morning, more than half a month's rain fell on a single spot. Over the 48-hour window surrounding the event, precipitation totals nearly tripled the monthly average for the whole region. Long-term Wellingtonians described it as the worst flooding they had witnessed since a devastating 1976 storm. The rain was not the same everywhere. The storm produced what meteorologists describe as highly localized, intense downpours. Some streets flooded catastrophically while neighboring streets were merely wet. That unevenness is not random. It reflects the geography of the city and the physics of how this specific type of storm generates and concentrates its rainfall. The system that produced Monday's disaster was not a tropical cyclone. It was very different in origin from Cyclone Vaianu, which had swept through the North Island just 1 week earlier. Monday's event was a large, slow-moving, low-pressure system that originated in the Southern Ocean, drawing cold air northward over an unusually warm Tasman Sea. When cold air moves over warm sea surface temperatures, it generates convection, the rapid upward movement of warm, moist air that produces thunderstorms and intense, localized downpours. Professor James Renwick, a climate scientist at Victoria University, explained that converging winds along Wellington's south coast helped drive moisture upwards and hold intense rainfall over the same areas for extended periods. In other words, the geography of Wellington itself, a city built on steep hills around a harbor, exposed to the south coast, funneling winds through narrow valleys, concentrated the storm's energy over specific suburbs and held it there. Island Bay, Berhampore, Newtown, Brooklyn, Mornington, the Basin Reserve Area, Karori, Mount Cook, Ōwhiro Bay. These are not random targets. They are the places where the city's topography and the storm's dynamics intersected most violently. The second thing you need to understand is what was already wrong with the ground before Monday arrived. A week earlier, Cyclone Vaianu had passed through the North Island. Vaianu was a genuine tropical cyclone, warm core, moisture-laden, originating in the tropics, and it had brought substantial rainfall to much of the lower North Island. By the time Monday's Southern Ocean system arrived, the soil across Wellington and the surrounding region was not just damp, it was saturated. Soil that is saturated cannot absorb new water. It has no capacity left. When rain falls on saturated ground, it does not sink in. It runs off immediately into streams, into drains, into roads, into basements, and through floors. The Karori stream that reached a flow rate of 100 cubic meters per second on Monday morning was not fed only by Monday morning's rain. It was fed by a landscape that had already given everything it had to absorb over the previous week and had nothing left. This is why meteorologists and climate scientists consistently warn that the danger from a weather event is not determined only by the event itself, but by what came before. Vaianu and Monday's Southern Ocean system, taken in isolation, might each have produced serious but manageable outcomes. Together, in sequence, they produced something that exceeded what Wellington's infrastructure, its stormwater systems, its stream channels, and its terrain could contain. A comment in Wellington. Scoop captured it plainly. With that volume of water over that time period, the state of the drains is essentially irrelevant. No drainage system built for a Wellington that the city's designers imagined is capable of handling 77 millimeters of rainfall in a single hour on top of already saturated ground. The water had to go somewhere, and it went through houses. The third thing to understand is what the warnings actually said and what people were able to do with them. Met Service issued its red heavy rain warning, the strongest category, meaning immediate action required, threat to life, at 2 p.m. on Monday, April 20th. That is an afternoon warning for a disaster that had begun at 3:30 in the morning. The warning system upgraded as the event unfolded, which is how warning systems work. They respond to data, and the data takes time to arrive. But the people of Karori, of Mount Cook, of Ōwhiro Bay, did not have the luxury of an afternoon warning. They were already in the water at 4 a.m. Meteorologist Katie Lyons from Met Service said in a press release, "A red warning signifies that people need to act now as immediate action is required to protect people, animals, and property from the impact of the weather." That is true. It is also true that by the time those words were published, Philip Sutton's car was already in Karori Stream. Weather experts, speaking afterward, acknowledged what they called limitations on what can be forecast in localized areas. The storm produced intense, localized rainfall that the models could predict in aggregate terms, but not in precise, street-by-street terms. They knew a serious storm was coming. They could not know that Karori South Road would become ground zero. Wellington Regional Emergency Management Office declared a state of emergency at 2:30 p.m. on Monday. The declaration was made by WCEM controller Carrie McKenzie, who said, "This is a serious weather event with ongoing and evolving risks. People across the region were advised to move out of low-lying and flood-prone areas, to stay home if their homes were safe, to avoid non-essential travel, to check on neighbors." Between 3:30 a.m. and 11 a.m., Fire and Emergency New Zealand responded to more than 180 calls regarding flooding and landslides. By any measure, that is a city in crisis. The cable car was shut. Te Papa Museum closed. Wellington Zoo closed. Victoria University closed all campuses. 28 flights were canceled at Wellington Airport, with more to follow. Trains and buses were still running, but passengers were urged to go home early. All harbor ferry services were canceled. Residents who needed emergency shelter were directed to Wellington City Mission on Oxford Terrace in Mount Cook. More than a dozen people were evacuated. Residents in Wainuiomata, a suburb on the eastern side of the hills, were told to evacuate due to rising river levels. The stories coming out of individual suburbs that day form a picture that no official statement captures. In the suburb of Brooklyn, a man named Carlton Ruffle was woken by a thunderstorm at 4 a.m. He went to his kitchen window to check on creek work happening at the back of his property, flood protection being installed, a project that had been underway and was now completely overwhelmed. He watched the road outside flow like a river. Over the next 20 minutes, the water rose until it submerged a digger that had been sitting in the creek. He told RNZ, "I went to the kitchen because we have some work going on the creek, would you believe? Some flood protection being put in, and the worksite was becoming inundated. The road was just flowing like a river, and then over about the next 20 minutes, the water got higher and higher until it covered a digger that was sitting in the creek. A digger. Underwater. That is the scale of what the streams were doing on Monday morning." In Kingston, a resident tried to escape the neighborhood on the back of his neighbor's motorbike after a landslide buried the road. He told reporters, "It's definitely a big event. You wouldn't have wanted to be under it. It wouldn't have been survivable." In Mornington, a resident described his garden as inundated with water. You couldn't see the grass or anything. There was a huge deluge, a flow, a river in fact, flowing through the garden. In Vogeltown, a house on Liardet Street partially collapsed after a hillside slip undercut its foundations, leaving the structure dangling. In Berhampore, around 10 houses were declared uninhabitable by Wellington City Council. 2 elderly blind residents were carried from their flooded Wellington home. A man in Ōwhiro Bay said his family was lucky not to die. In Karori, the engineering geologist Carrie Leith, speaking to the Science Media Center, said there was a really good chance of more slips occurring in Wellington because of the really intense rain, the hill slopes already being wet, and the impact of damage to infrastructure such as retaining walls, stormwater pipes, and footpaths. Each slip creates new vulnerability. Each section of broken retaining wall allows more soil to move. Each cracked stormwater pipe redirects water somewhere it was not supposed to go. Over 450 structures across the affected areas sustained damage. Landslides blocked residential streets, isolated homes, cut off access to properties. Road closures spread across the city. State Highway 2 before the Melling Interchange, Riverside Drive in Lower Hutt, flooding on State Highway 53 in Featherston, Harcourt Wherry Drive closed by afternoon. Red heavy rain warnings were extended across Wellington and Wairarapa, with forecasts of 100 to 150 millimeters in the eastern hills and Hutt Valley and up to 280 millimeters in some ranges. A severe thunderstorm warning was issued for Carterton and Masterton. Orange warnings were placed on the Tararua district. Heavy rain watches covered Tai Hape, Wanganui, Manawatu, Horowenua, the Kapiti Coast, Porirua, and Hawke's Bay. The lower North Island was not experiencing a Wellington event. It was experiencing a regional event that was using Wellington as its most visible and most tragic face. I want to come back to Philip Sutton, because his story deserves more than the paragraph he has received in most news coverage, and because it connects to something larger that this disaster is forcing Wellington to confront. Philip was a postman. He walked the streets of Karori for more than 20 years. He was known. He was part of how the neighborhood worked. One of those people whose daily presence is so reliable that it becomes invisible, part of the background of a functioning community, noticed most clearly by its absence. His NZ Post colleague Brendan Main, the chief operating officer, said, "We are very sad to confirm that an NZ Post team member has been reported missing in Wellington following the recent flooding. Our thoughts are with our colleague, their family, friends, and loved ones in this very difficult situation. We are also supporting our team in Wellington. That is a corporate statement. But behind it is something simpler. A group of people who worked with someone for more than 20 years, who are trying to do their jobs while waiting for news about their colleague, who are processing grief on a Wednesday afternoon while also figuring out how to deliver the post. The Karori stream at 100 cubic meters per second of flow is not something that gives a person a chance. Police Constable Steve Ewart noted the substantial distance between where the car was found and where the body was recovered. A kilometer between the car and the stream entry point, 7 kilometers of stream and coastline between the property and where Philip was finally found. That distance tells you something about the force of what moved through Karori on Monday morning. It moved a car. It carried it a kilometer. And then the water took Philip's body 7 kilometers to the sea before it could be recovered. Inspector DeBest said the floodwaters hit very rapidly, very quickly, with ferocious strength. That phrase, ferocious strength, is the right one. The Karori stream at 100 cubic meters per second is not metaphorically ferocious. It is physically ferocious. It is a mass of water moving at a speed and volume that gives a person standing in its path essentially no options. Now I want to talk about why this happened when it did, and what the science tells us about whether it will happen again, because that is the question that Wellington now has to sit with in a way it has not had to before. In the 48-hour window around Monday's event, rainfall totals nearly tripled monthly averages. This happened 1 week after Cyclone Vaianu. Wellington has experienced major flooding events before. The 1976 storm is the reference point for long-term residents, the disaster against which others are measured. But the pace at which significant events are arriving is changing. The climate science on this is not ambiguous. A warming atmosphere holds more moisture, roughly 7% more water vapor for every 1 degree Celsius of warming. More moisture in the atmosphere means storms can draw on more water and release more water when they finally let it go. It means that when a low-pressure system moves over a warm Tasman Sea and generates convection, the convective cells that produce the downpours are drawing on more moisture than they would have drawn on 20 or 30 years ago. The 77 millimeters in 1 hour that Wellington recorded on Monday morning is not the ceiling. It is a milestone on a trajectory. Met Service's warning had flagged dangerous conditions. The civil defense machinery worked as it is supposed to work. Declarations were made, evacuations were ordered, emergency shelters were opened, search and rescue teams were deployed, dive squads were mobilized, and a man was still dead. The gap between what our warning systems can do and what the event actually required is a gap that deserves honest examination. The localized nature of the storm's worst rainfall, the way it concentrated over specific streets and valleys in ways that models could not predict with the precision that residents needed, is a known limitation of weather forecasting in complex terrain. Wellington's terrain is nothing if not complex. It is a city of steep hills, narrow valleys, streams that are culverted in some sections and open in others, running through residential neighborhoods, carrying the runoff from entire catchments through pipes and channels designed decades ago for rainfall patterns that no longer describe the future. Ian Shearer, commenting in Wellington, Scoop in the Aftermath, noted that the 2 streams that did the most damage in Monday's storm, the Ōwhiro stream and the Karori stream, are open streams, not culverted ones. They run between restricted banks, through narrow valleys with steep hills, out to the sea. The topography restricted them and the level of rainfall was exceptional. Both of those things are true. And both of those things will be true again, because the topography is permanent and the rainfall intensity is increasing. Wellington has a choice to make, and it is not a comfortable one. It can continue managing a city that was designed for a climate that no longer exists, or it can begin the difficult, expensive, politically contentious process of redesigning itself for the climate that is arriving. Emergency Management and Recovery Minister Mark Mitchell said before the worst of Monday's weather that people should be prepared, should make evacuation decisions early, and should keep themselves updated with information. That advice is correct, and it is also insufficient on its own. Individual preparedness matters. Mick Breitenbach and her flatmates had a go bag from Cyclone Vaianu, and it helped them get out of a flooding house faster. But individual preparedness cannot compensate for drainage infrastructure that is overwhelmed by 77 millimeters of rain in an hour. It cannot prevent the Karori stream from reaching 100 cubic meters per second. It cannot make a house on Karori South Road survivable when the stream that flows past it is running at 25 times its normal peak capacity. The work of making Wellington safer from the storms that are coming is a collective work, and it is a government work, and it is expensive, and it is slow, and it requires political will that is always easier to find the week after a disaster than in the years before one. Wellington is still under its state of emergency as this script is being written today, Wednesday, April the 22nd. The red warnings have begun to ease but have not fully lifted. Saturated ground across the region continues to pose landslide risk. Streams remain elevated. Communities in the lower North Island from Wanganui to Hawke's Bay are dealing with their own flooding in the wake of the same system. Rural Hawke's Bay has been described as an ocean by some residents. The cleanup will take weeks. The damage assessment will take longer. The rebuilding of the 10 or more houses in Berhampore and South Karori declared uninhabitable. The process of finding those families somewhere to live, of navigating insurance, of repairing or rebuilding, will take months. The deeper work of making Wellington more resilient to the next event and the next Vaianu, the next Southern Ocean low, the next 77 millimeters in an hour, will take years and requires decisions that have not yet been made. Philip Sutton's family has asked for their privacy to be respected. They expressed thanks for the public's concern. His colleagues at NZ Post are supporting each other. His community in Karori is dealing with both the grief of losing someone they knew and the physical reality of a neighborhood that has been physically altered by what the water did. The road is blocked by debris in places. Trees are down. The stream channel is different now than it was before Monday morning. The landscape has been rearranged. That is what a stream at 100 cubic meters per second does to a valley it passes through. It moves things, rocks and soil and cars and, in the worst way, people. Wellington has been through difficult things before. The 1931 Hawke's Bay earthquake, the 1968 Wahine ferry disaster, the 1976 flooding storm that current residents still cite as a benchmark. It is a resilient city in the truest sense. Not in the lazy use of that word that disaster coverage applies to communities to avoid thinking harder about what happened, but in the specific sense that its people consistently look after each other when things go wrong. On Monday morning, while emergency services were stretched across a city in crisis, neighbors were carrying elderly blind residents out of their flooded homes. A Kingston resident climbed on the back of his neighbor's motorbike to escape a landslide. Flatmates in Mount Cook interlocked their arms and walked through floodwater together. A man in Ōwhiro Bay held his family together through a night that he said they were lucky not to die in. That is what community looks like when the infrastructure has been overwhelmed and the official response is still mobilizing. But a city cannot run on neighborly heroism alone. Wellington is New Zealand's capital. It is home to around 210,000 people. It is the center of the country's political and civic life. And it has just experienced what a climate scientist described as rainfall that would be extreme even in the tropics, for the second major weather event in 8 days, on ground that was already saturated, in a city whose infrastructure was not built for what is coming. Philip Sutton walked Wellington's streets for 20 years. He knew those streets in all their weather. And on Monday morning, in the early hours before dawn, the water that came through Karori was faster and deeper and more violent than anything the streets had been built to contain. That is the fact that Wellington now has to live with, and plan for, and act on. Because the storm that took Philip was not the last storm. It was, in the language of climate science and meteorological probability, part of a pattern that is intensifying. The question is not whether Wellington will experience another event like this. The question is what kind of city it chooses to be when it does. If this channel, honest storytelling about real events, real people, real consequences, is what brought you here, please subscribe. These stories need to be told in full, not in fragments, not in headlines, not in summary. Philip Sutton deserved more than a caption. Wellington deserved more than a news ticker. And you deserved all of it. I will see you in the next video.